Good morning. My name is Barry Caver. I'm currently the Assistant Chief Deputy with the Denton County Sheriff's Office. Today I want to talk about a critical incident that happened right after I became Texas Ranger Captain out in Midland, Odessa area. This occurred back in April the 27th of 1997. I'd been a Ranger Captain for about 6 months when this incident occurred. We had received information from my local ranger that a couple had been kidnapped at gunpoint in their own home by a group of individuals calling themselves the Republic of Texas. This was a subversive group that was sort of ran by a gentleman by the name of Richard McLaren, who claimed to be the ambassador to the Republic of Texas. This group was very unique. They're a very anti-government type group that claimed that Texas was illegally annexed in 1845 into the Union. Obviously, in my position in the Texas Rangers became very critical later on because the Texas Rangers began in 1823, and they recognized my position and status within the Texas Rangers, making me a legitimate person to deal with in their later on in their hostage negotiations issues. This was a situation where a gentleman had been arrested earlier that day by the sheriff of Jeff Davis County. And one of their members that had been arrested was on some minor traffic violations and I think a weapons violation and maybe a no liability insurance. They believed in retaliation they were going to break into the Rose home, who they felt like was a spy for the government watching their movements. So they broke in at gunpoint. And during the gun battle, Mr. Rowe was injured by a gunshot wound. He was a heart patient, and obviously we were very concerned about his medical needs. And I felt like it was incumbent upon me as the incident commander to do everything I could in my power to have him released in order for him to not suffer any more medical related issues. But upon the scene, when we arrived, myself and about 15 other Texas Rangers near Fort Davis, Texas, in the Davis Mountains, we gathered information as to where they were and what they wanted. But at that point in time, no one had taken the opportunity to actually call the Rose residents to discuss the issues with the hostage takers to figure out why they were doing this and what they wanted. I immediately did this. We had set up, let me back up, we had set up a command post at a nearby neighbor's home who was actually a current Border Patrol agent. So he was more than happy to allow us to use part of his home as a command post to deal with these hostage takers. As the company commander, I called the residents and talked to the 3 different hostage takers, and they basically said that they had been ordered by McLaren to take these people hostage in retaliation for the fact that this other group member had been arrested earlier that day. Probably after 10 to 12 hours of negotiations, I finally was able to talk them into releasing Mr. Rowe because of his medical condition, but they wanted in return the release of this group member from the jail. Obviously, this is very unorthodox. And first of all, you don't deal with terrorists. I mean, we've been taught that my whole career. But I believe that at some point in time, and what I learned from this is the fact that I believe that we need to do everything possible to secure the release of the injured person and maybe think outside the box and to do whatever it takes as a human being to make sure that this situation is handled properly and appropriately. So luckily, they agreed to those demands, or we agreed to those demands rather, and released the gentleman from jail who was just on misdemeanor charges anyway. I allowed one of my Rangers to dress up as a EMT paramedic. We sent an ambulance down to get Mr. Rowe. At the same time, we took the gentleman that had been released from jail and basically did a swap. Obviously, we were very concerned with anything at all going wrong with that situation. Obviously that we were putting my men and these other people in harm's way if something bad happened, but luckily everything went smoothly, did just exactly as we had planned it, and everything was fine. Once we got Mr. Rowe out though, the other hostage takers and the gentleman that was released from jail was allowed to return back into the Davis Mountains to their so-called embassy, which was basically a 1957 travel trailer that had been converted into an office type space. First of all, just to kind of recap that so far, in the fact that I quickly learned that I could not be the lead negotiator and incident commander in the same breath. There were so many different issues that would come up during this process of this 10 or 12 hours of negotiation that I had to decide upon. And it was extremely overwhelming to me to be in both of those roles. Obviously, since then, we have learned from our ways, and this has been something that we've tried to improve upon. Not to mention the fact that no one in my ranger company, including myself, had been trained in formal hostage negotiations. So we have since sent everyone to training to be a negotiator, because being in the Rangers, you're assigned and stationed in so many rural areas that more than likely you're going to be the primary lead investigator and lead agent on any kind of case that comes up. So I wanted my men to be equally trained so they could handle any kind of minor situation within their jurisdiction as well as it arisen. We quickly learned that, and this incident lasted about 7 days. So we quickly learned as well that the basic needs for survival were not being met or going to be met. Luckily, we had a lot of volunteer organizations such as churches, local neighbors and such that provided food and water to us. But again, you forget this is a very rural area. The resources were very limited, and so as a result of that, we've also stockpiled some MREs, cases of water, medical supplies, and that sort of thing to be able to travel with us at any given moment when such of these things might occur in the future. Also learned that as a result, we had to, as this thing progressed and played out over the 7 days, there were several different threats made by Mr. McLaren. At one point, he threatened to set the canyon on fire, and obviously that would be a great concern of ours, and the fact that I had probably at that point in time 200 to 300 men in that area. I was inundated with volunteer police organizations that were wanting to come in and help relieve and help with the situation. But the problem was, again, we learned from our not necessarily mistakes, but having done this, we had no incident command system in place. There was really, I think in police work, we really didn't even know what that was. Luckily, because of the fire threats, we contacted our counterparts with the Texas Forest Service, and they quickly responded with equipment such as tractors, bulldozers, and that sort of thing to be able to cut fire breaks in certain areas that would help protect us and our command post from being burned out if his threats came true. But what they also brought with them was a incident command system that they had used in fire situations, especially out in California, whenever they would go to respond to those. So we quickly learned from them as to a systematic way to keep track of every officer that reported for duty, his name, where he would be assigned to the area, how long he had been there and such, so we could rotate our manpower in and out. And again, I allowed the Texas Forest Service to do that because that was their expertise. We did not know how to do that at that point in time. Also strongly encourage you to make contact with your local, either county, city, or state officials, because DPS has a regional emergency management coordinator. Those guys, I found later on, were extremely invaluable in providing us, mainly resources that food, shelter, water, that sort of thing, the main requirements to survive out in the open like that. I mean, we were trying to sleep in tents, sleeping bags. Some of the neighbors were kind enough to open up their homes. Since we evacuated them, they allowed us to sleep in there. but it was a situation that I had never seen the likes of before. But I believe that early on, though, we had developed somewhat of a relationship with Mr. McLaren and his group, because we knew they were making a lot of threats before this situation ever happened, and we knew the people we were dealing with. And I think it's very, very important to get to know these people, at least put a face to a name. Know these people, that way they know you. You may not necessarily trust them, but at least you have a face to a name, and they've met you, that maybe that there's been some kind of trust or some kind of relationship made there that ended up being very, very important later on down the road as we finally ended this siege peacefully. I think it's incumbent upon us as incident commanders to be patient and do things, again, think outside the box and do things that may not be necessarily in the policy manuals or procedures, but as long as you don't violate any of those rules. But again, there's no way in the world that we can have policies and procedures that are going to deal with every single scenario that we in law enforcement are going to come across. It's just not going to happen. But I believe that we're going to have to do whatever it takes to make this resolution a success, because once this is all said and done and it's all resolved, there's so many different armchair quarterbacks out here that the media is going to talk to. They're going to get these professional opinions on things that more than likely these people have never been involved in a situation like this before. And it depends on, especially if we end up having to fire shots and someone may get injured or killed in the process, we're going to have to show that we did every single thing possible that was in our toolbox to resolve this thing peacefully. Because as you know, the sentiment towards law enforcement today is very critical. And the media and the public are going to look at things that we did or even perhaps didn't do that maybe or maybe not could have solved this thing. But we've got to show that we made every move possible to make sure that we ended this situation peacefully. But sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. You've got to be able to articulate why you made certain decisions and decided to do things in a certain way. Hopefully, as we move forward, I know that we in the Texas Rangers have certainly learned from this. Hopefully that something we did during this event that would help another agency deal with a similar type situation. And as always, I'm always available to answer any questions or concerns that another agency may have. As a result of this, I traveled all over the United States talking about some of the things that we did during this situation that, again, were unorthodox in law enforcement. So I think that as we move forward, we've got to continue to keep an open mind, be patient, and be willing to do whatever it takes to take care of these situations. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.